Welcome to the corner of Morris and Queen. My name is Chris Green, owner of Atlantic News. I'd like to welcome Joanne Roberts to our studios today. Joanne has a new book out, Storm the Ballot Box. Joanne, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, great to see you on this day when we're recording this. We have pending weather, so
we do.
So that'll help to keep me brief, and then we'll get you off the streets. But today we're going to talk about Joanne's book involving voting. We're going to talk about Joanne's varied background. She's been a journalist. She was a member of the Green Party, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So first of all, before we get to your book, Joanne, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. Did you start here in Nova Scotia and then go west, or did you start west and come here? Tell us a little bit about your...
I was actually born in PEI, but I always like to say I'm a maritimer at large. My father's a Newfoundlander. My mother's from PEI. Spent a lot of time in Nova Scotia and then went to school in New Brunswick. And I started my career, I have a political science degree from Mount Allison, very proud Allisonian, you know what it's like when you run into people from Mount A. And then I went to Carleton University and did a journalism degree. And a lot of people say, why journalism? And I went, you got to remember, this was 1977, 78, and All the President's Men was the best movie out there. And journalists were bringing down presidents, you know, and Barbara Frum was on the radio. And so
is that David Frum's mother?
It is.
It is, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just a great Canadian icon.
Right.
And she was a CBC, as it happens, host, and I just admired her. So I got a journalism degree because I was going to save the world, right? And ended up back in New Brunswick editing a weekly newspaper, which is not exactly where you save the world. But
well, you have to start somewhere.
And you know what? You discover very quickly how important local news is, how important it is to get it right.
And we'll talk about that later,
yeah.
some of the issues.
But that's where
there.
I started.
Yeah.
And then I went to the CBC. I was fortunate. They were, affirmative action. They were hiring more women. I was the first woman in the newsroom in St. John, New Brunswick.
Wow.
And I had two great mentors. And it was the heyday of the CBC. If you had a story that you could make a case for to your editor, they didn't ask you how much will it cost. They said, go get it.
Right. We're going to talk about that later, too, some of the issues with CBC.
So I spent 5 years as a reporter in television and in radio, and then had our first child, and then started moving. We lived in Winnipeg, and then we came back to the Maritimes, and then we moved to Moncton, and then we moved to Victoria, BC. And I went back to the CBC 12 years after I left it the first time, and I was a host for 20 years. I was the host of the morning show in Moncton for 10 years, and I was the host of the afternoon show in BC for 10 years.
Wow, so 40 years
as
in
a
journalism.
journalist.
then the next chapter was with the Green Party.
Yeah, I ran as a Green Party candidate. I didn't even start as like a volunteer.
Right, and that's in your book. You talk about it. It's fantastic. You go through the experiences of that. So you ran in a riding in Victoria?
In Victoria.
Yeah.
So it's right for people who kind of are trying to position that. It's right next to Elizabeth May's riding. So Elizabeth May, a lot of people know Elizabeth.
The leader of the Green Party, one of the co-leaders now.
Co-leaders.
Yeah.
And she, she's the person who recruited me. And so I was running in the riding next to her. So it was a riding that had an opportunity to go green.
And a fantastic mentor.
Yeah, she was.
That's great.
And so I came second. I mean, and I'll tell you, your first loss is the worst loss you'll ever have as a politician. And I was crushed by it. I came so close. I mean, now I realize how close was I. But I was second.
Well, when one theme with politicians or people that run for office, most of the time you lose the first time.
You do.
Right? So Green Party experience, we'll talk about that. And now you've written a book. So this book, Storm the Ballot Box. What's your book about?
Well, I think the subtitle, An Insider's Guide to a Voting Revolution, tells you sort of what it's about. I felt there was a lot of things that as a journalist who'd covered politics for 40 years, I thought I knew a lot. I mean, I'm a political science grad, fascinated by politics since I was a child. I discovered when I became a politician how much about politics I didn't know from the inside, the inner workings, if I can put it. And I know that sounds kind of boring and who cares, but I discovered things that I think it's important people start talking about. And I am super concerned with the fact that in this country, a third of eligible voters have stopped voting. Like a third of our country doesn't vote. 11 million Canadians federally. In Nova Scotia, in our last election, over half.
Right,
55% didn't vote.
So as an American who's has his PR and is becoming a dual citizen, I've always looked to Canada, thinking, wow, why could the States be more like Canada with more people voting? Yeah, the numbers you talk about, the 2024 election here in Nova Scotia, 45% of eligible voters turned out. Yeah. That is down 10% from the election in 2021, where 55%. And in reading an article on it, a local political scientist, Alex Marland, who we both know, he gave a couple of reasons for this that make a lot of sense, right? And so there are excuses, but there is a trend. There was the snap election. So that was right away. Yeah. And on top of the snap election, voter election cards were not sent by mail. Now, I know that there was a strike, but it sounds like maybe some corners were cut there, and of course that makes a difference. And Alex also mentions the decline in local media. So a lot of reasons, but yes, we have 45% of eligible voters voting. So you seem to start off with that. And he did not
mention it was December. Like,
right.
I mean, I also think, and the Premier and I have a bit of a disagreement over when people want to vote, but I think there are times when people don't want to vote. One of them is in December when they're getting ready for Christmas.
Right.
And the other one is in the middle of the summer when they're enjoying a vacation. And if you know, our fixed election date in the province of Nova Scotia is the 25th of July.
And that was set by who?
By him, Premier Houston.
Okay, yeah. So we're seeing a trend here.
So it is a trend. And I would say Alex is right on all three counts.
Right. So while there are reasons for this, this is troubling, certainly.
Yeah.
So your book, you go through and you tell your story, and what's fantastic about it, what I really appreciated about it, is that you go through and you give 20 some odd, a number of proposals, but the proposals are tied in with stories that you tell. So there's some background, which was very helpful. So tell us about these proposals. There are quite a few in here. What are some of them that you want to start out with in terms of how to get people voting in higher numbers again here in Canada and in Nova Scotia?
Okay, let me give you one or maybe two that would have prevented what happened in Nova Scotia.
Yes.
And this one's controversial, and I know I'm going to hear people scream when I say it.
Okay,
any election that has a turnout less than 50% has to be rerun.
Yes, that.
Okay, and I know.
Well, that got my attention. So basically, it's like redo. Okay, all of you voted. That doesn't count. It doesn't matter. We're going to do it again.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk about that, because that seems problematic on a couple of levels.
But
how would that help?
Well, because I think it would force politicians to make sure they think about how many people are going to come out to vote. And it would have given, I think, the Premier of Nova Scotia a little pause to say, do I want an election in December? Do I want to call a snap election?
Right.
And I think because if I make the case, and I think you can, that if we, in first past the post, 50% is considered, you have to pass it to win. Mm-hmm. You have to get the majority of votes. Well, if the majority of people don't vote, how do you call that legitimate?
Right.
And so I think the case can be made that it's not legitimate. If we look at Europe, if they have runoff votes, for example. So maybe if it's redone, it has to be done as a runoff. But it's still going to cost them money. And it's going to mean they have to prolong the election process.
Right. Now it's going to cost some money. That's out of the taxpayers' pockets.
Out of our taxpayers' pockets.
So that's
But this
problematic.
election, which was totally unnecessary, because it wasn't a fixed election date, he did not need a mandate.
So this
for
was
anything.
the snap
It
election.
cost us money.
So this touches on another one of your proposals in talking about how elections are done here in Canada. Because with all the problems down south, it was interesting for me to come here and find that elections could just pop up like this. Yeah. And so another one of your proposals talks, it's multifaceted, but it talks about how to fix election day. Why don't you talk about some of those?
Well, and
one of them is the ability to call a snap election.
Call a snap election. election, and I think basically these are guidelines, these fixed election dates. There's no consequences for someone to call an election.
Well, from what I understand, Mr. Houston, when he was elected, said, okay, we're going to have an election at this date, and then he turned around and
it was his first piece of legislation.
Yeah.
We were the only province in Canada that did not have fixed election date legislation.
Right. Now, from my understanding of the system here and where it came from, the snap election goes back to being under the British, and I could see it being helpful if something really goes off the rails. Okay, we're going to have an election.
Like a war.
But it's not, these, in the last 5-10 years, it's never used that way. It's always used, it's at the whim of the leader that says, hey, I think I can win.
I've seen the polls.
Yeah.
I think I can win.
And
Doug Ford's doing it right now. Doug Ford says he needs a mandate. He has a huge majority. He does not need a mandate for anything. But he's holding an election because he thinks he can win. Because who holds an election in February in Northern Ontario? Anyway.
Right.
But my point is there should be consequences. I actually am in favor of fixed election dates.
Fixed elections.
I think they allow everyone to plan, all parties.
It makes a lot of sense. And so on top of that, you do it, and I totally agree with you. It should be a national holiday. Don't do it in the summer when people are at the beach.
No.
Don't do it at Christmas. Do it at a time where the fall.
Spring or fall will
do. The fall or everything is back. That's what they do down south, right? It's on a particular day, but they don't. It's not a holiday. Many countries, as you well know,
Australia,
for a democracy, this is one of the most, if not the most important things that we do. Shouldn't it be a day where
it a party?
Make it,
in my opinion,
make it a holiday. Like you mentioned, have the buses take people to the voting places now,
free of charge.
Free of charge, yeah. Now, what we both know is that if any of this is going to work, the individuals, the men and women that run for office have to want people to vote.
They do, and now I don't believe they do.
No, and that's
our fundamental
problem. That comes from both parties, right? But
it comes from, I would say, all parties.
Right.
The two major parties, it certainly is in their best efforts not to have people vote that they don't know how they're going to vote.
And what an issue if the people that are running are doing this. Citizens are busy and are going to say, well, geez, but yeah. So making it no one in Canada is responsible for making sure people vote. We have lots of organizations. Don't you have an election committee?
We have an Elections Canada, and their responsibility is to make voting accessible, but they're not allowed to, go out and start, a barbecue to get people to come to the voting station. Right.
Well,
and they cannot push for holiday legislation.
Right. So that needs to be sitting politicians that pass this through. This touches on another one of your proposals, and that is mandatory voting.
Now,
talk about that.
Okay. So I realize that there's very little appetite in Canada right now for mandatory voting, and I would say it's not a great time to bring it in. I think we should try everything else and before we go there, because I do think you should want to vote. But
again, it's a responsibility. It's a right that we have
of citizenship.
But of course, forcing people to vote, almost like you force your kid to clean his room. I'm thinking of my 14-year-old.
Yeah.
They might come in and make a choice based on having to do something. So this is fraught with yes.
Although spoiled ballots in Australia. And Australia is kind of the example everyone uses when they talk about mandatory voting.
Because Australia has fines if you don't vote.
Yeah, $50.
Which is interesting. I was having a discussion on the car ride in with my wife and my 14-year-old, and we all agreed that, okay, because you think mandatory voting, and then
do you know what?
And tied to this, it was I mentioned one of the proposals of the author was for 16-year-olds for vote, and my 14-year-old popped up and went, "Hey!" And my wife and I looked at each other and went, not sure about that.
Yeah.
She came up one way around that, right? Because I believe that if, and of course I want to hear you, who cares what I believe? But if you're going to have 16-year-old votes, that has to follow. There needs to be a lot of groundwork with how civics is taught in the schools, and I know that's a bombshell. I used to teach social studies down south, and it's a bombshell. What do you include? But I would think if you're going to do that, there needs to be a very good understanding of what these kids are going through in the schools.
It's true. So let me go back to mandatory voting.
Yes, I've thrown a lot in
Okay,
here. Yes.
because I want to deal with both of these issues because
Yes.
they're the most
They're
controversial
tied
in the
together,
book. So what's the fine for not filling out your census? Do you know?
No idea. Is there a fine?
There is.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is either, but nobody cares. But they do their census, and it is mandatory. What about filing your income tax? Now, I bet you know what the fine is there. I do. They charge you interest on what you owe them.
Now, those two are very different from choosing a leader.
But why are they different than choosing our government?
Now, the other two are paperwork.
So is a vote. Like, you really go in and put an X on a ballot.
Yeah.
It takes less time than your income tax.
Yes, yeah. And you could see a small fine for doing it.
And in most cases, if you have a good reason,
yeah,
you don't pay the fine.
Right.
So Australia has found that the one thing that I think has to go with this, because this is what people say, you can't force me to vote for anybody. And I agree with that. But we need to add none of the above to each ballot. So that if you walk into that, voting booth.
This would send a message, wow, they're not speaking to the needs of...
And you see that I don't want Buddy and I don't want her and I don't want that guy. But you can fill out the ballot that says none of the above. What does that say to politicians? And they can't control that, right? So I think there's an advantage. If we were to ever go to mandatory voting, and as I say, I'd rather see incentives. I think, why aren't we giving people a free pass to the national park when they come to vote? Why aren't we having a barbecue, having it on a Saturday, providing, we now have, you can vote almost any day of an election. But
there are things you could do. Yeah, and I know voting before, it happened quite a bit in the municipal elections. Voting before the election, and that has grown quite a bit for people that can't go. I know we're trying to get people to vote more, and a lot of things you mentioned can be things that don't cost the government money.
That's right.
Because that's the key. You're gonna get people's backs up if we're paying for this, the government's paying for this. That'll be a tougher sell.
Yeah, and you know what? I think I'm quite willing to sort of take that on. My argument in return to that is we give incentives in this country for a lot of things. You get a tax break if you put your kids in soccer because we think it's really important to have kids that are fit. I don't disagree with that.
Right. There are incentives to buy a heat pump.
Yeah,
which
is a good thing. And there was until recently incentives to buy electric vehicles. But, I think not having an incentive to vote, the incentive should be we get good government. But because we're seeing a whole generation of voters that are not voting, we need to start doing something.
Right.
And that's I had this discussion with my mother, who's 92 and has voted in every election she's been eligible for. And you know why? Because she knows that members of her family fought for the right to vote. They know that right can disappear. They know what that's like. That generation, unfortunately, we're losing. We're the children of that generation, so we've heard our parents tell us.
Well, you forget the importance of it, don't you?
You do.
Yeah.
Like, I think if you spoke to, a 22-year-old right now and said, did you know you could lose the right to vote? They go, what? No. We always vote in Canada.
Right.
I don't have to vote in this election because we always vote.
Now, it's having a 16-year-old vote.
Okay,
I think that's a longer discussion. Now, one idea that my better half came up with is because we thought a 16-year-old this is fraught with pitfalls. Well, what you could do is say, okay, 16-year-olds, you need to take a test, a civics test, just like somebody has to take to become a citizen. If you can pass that, you can vote. Now, you don't make an 18-year-old take a test, but that's one possibility.
One possibility. How about simply having proof that they took a civics course? Like, they don't even have to take the test on it, but they have to prove they took the course.
Right.
Because that's what, you have to do to be a
That could be a low bar.
It is a low bar.
Well, if you're doing that, that would assume that there is some sort of understanding about what's in these civics courses.
Yeah,
right?
and here's the other thing. This is where the research is important on this. Research has shown if you vote in the first election you are eligible for, so in Canada, 18, you will vote in every election thereafter. If you don't vote in that first election, you won't.
Yeah, I still remember the first time I voted for president.
Yeah.
Yes. No.
I think what's happened is 18-year-olds are the largest group of people not voting. And that speaks very poorly for the future, right? So I I spent a lot of time as a candidate going into schools. One of the stories I tell in the book is conservative candidates in the last federal election, they decided they weren't going to any schools. You know why they don't go to schools? Not because they don't like kids, but those people don't vote.
Right.
So if this group of people
So it's a vicious circle,
are
isn't it?
going to
Yeah.
be our next generation of people in our country, we need to have them engaged. And I think one of the ways to engage them, I mean, we lowered our voting age in Canada from 21 to 18. Do you know how many years that took? 45 years since the first time it was introduced to when we decided to lower the voting age.
And does Canada have, there was a policy put in down south a while ago, motor voter law, which was very helpful. And that was when you go and register at the Department of Motor Vehicles for your license, there's an opportunity to register to vote.
As a voter.
To register as a vote. And that was quite helpful. And then different... traditionally, the Republicans down south aren't so thrilled about people voting as much. That could be the conservatives here. I don't want to paint anybody with a brush.
No, we won't decide
right?
that.
We don't want to do that. But there are policies that you can do that good people could agree on that would give incentives and give people opportunities to register to vote. Now, that motor voter was just, you're not voting, you're registering. But that's the first step, right?
Yeah, So the other question I would have, and again, I realize this is not going to come in overnight, but we allow 16-year-olds to have their license.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that there is a higher level of responsibility in driving your car. Now, you too take a test. So it's back to the, what your partner was saying about should you take a test to get your voter card at 16.
And then you have to take this test. This could lead to more discussions. There was just an article in the local paper by Paul Bennett last weekend about the social studies curriculum, right?
Yep.
And that's always been, in any democracy, that's going to be a hot issue. But
it is.
It could put this to the fore, that's for sure.
Even understanding how our voting system works is a concern of mine, and it's why I'm big on civics in school, because most of us that are in school, most kids who are in school now, are more influenced by American politics than they are Canadian, and so they think somehow we vote for prime minister, which we don't.
Right. So there were a number here, and we're not going to be able to touch on all of them in detail, but proportional voting. What I've learned is that Mr. Trudeau, when he came in, he promised that he was going to do this, and then it disappeared. I've the little research that I've done. There seems to be two types that you mentioned in your book: the mixed member,
proportional, MP,
and then the single transferable. And it sounds like that the the STV would be a little bit more easier to put in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, and you know what? I have learned that the mistake many politicians and many people who are activists for changing our voting system make is getting into the weeds of which one do we want. I think what we need to do is simply say, are you willing to have us change the voting system to the proportion of votes you get represents the proportion of people who are in the House of Commons. And if we could get that agreement, then we should try one and see how it works.
But people are going to want to know what the proposal is.
But they don't really. I mean, MMP is agreed to by the New Democratic Party. The Greens have said, we prefer STV, but the Greens in New Brunswick just went to MMP. I think MMP will come out ahead because it's easier to understand than STV.
Okay.
But in BC,
but in the MMP, this mixed member, you basically vote for a person and then you vote for a party. That means the riding size changes.
Yeah, you have
understanding.
Basically a riding represented by two people.
Right. So the size of the riding that
gets
representative gets bigger, and that so that takes a little bit of movement. Where in the STV, you're ranking candidates: first place, second place, third place. So that means that then a particular riding would send not just one but a couple individuals.
Yep.
So it doesn't change the number of MPs.
But again, you get larger ridings.
Interesting.
Right. Here's two things that proportional representation under either system do. One of them, the argument is made, is it makes it more expensive because you have a few more MPs, and that's worth considering. But it means that often you get, let's say, a New Democrat and a Conservative.
Well, it's better for democracy. Minority voices are heard.
And people have to collaborate. Like, we hear so much now about how polarized we're becoming. Well, when I was recently in Dublin, and I saw all of the big posters for people, and they would go, vote for us, number 1. And then we would be like to be your second choice. These are two different parties, right? Because they don't want someone to just win. They want someone to also come second.
Right.
So there's a reason to work together?
So from your understanding, what's the path to get proportional voting talked about? I mean, Mr. Trudeau, the second, he said he was going to do it, but then he got into office and he dropped it.
And he's not alone in that. Everybody who says they're going to do it finds a way out of it. Some people, it's go to referendums.
Because it's a tough thing to do.
Well, why would you change what got you elected in the first place?
Right.
It's been working for me. Why would I change it? So if it's not working for you, you're willing to change it. What has changed is there was just a poll done in the country, and 68% of Canadians are in favor of a new proportional form of representation. So what that is, again, they didn't ask. So
the discussion, hopefully this discussion will continue.
Well, it'll take a lot of political courage. I mean, it was what, Trudeau mentioned it 1,200 times in 2015. It helped turn his fortunes around because people were very upset with the Harper government and didn't know how someone who got 40% of the vote got 100% of the power.
Right.
The NDP backed it, the Greens backed it, and the Liberals backed it. So you had the majority of parties in the House.
He had his opportunity at the beginning.
He had his opportunity, and he didn't use it. So
there were other things.
I'm kind of discouraged. That's why I talk about a lot of things in addition to PR. PR fixes a lot of this.
Yeah. Now you mentioned, makes sense, former journalist, that there needs to be better funding for public broadcasting.
Yeah, and a lot of people will say, well, you work for the CBC, so of course you think that. But my argument is this, and a lot of my colleagues who work in private broadcasting, who work for newspapers, I think would agree with me on this one. The CBC, or a public broadcaster, needs to be an independent voice in the marketplace, because then it does sort of make the marketplace more competitive, and it gives those who are owned by big corporations more of a way to say, well, we need to do this story because it's already out there. And the CBC has that role. It also can do things that the private market can't do. Go to northern communities, broadcast in First Nations languages. So we need a way, and Canada has been very fortunate. We have had a public broadcaster that has united the country. You can listen to As It Happens right across this country at the same time, and you can call your friends in BC and say, you should hear this interview, and they'll hear it. They don't even have that in the United States with NPR. NPR
is on the run. They're on their heels. Yeah. They have been a big target. CBC's on their heels at the moment, aren't they? There have been articles about defunding or cutting funding.
Party is running, the Conservative Party is running on defunding the CBC. But I notice they're starting to now
pull back from that a little bit.
Pull back a little bit from that, and I'm glad to see it. I mean, they're saying, oh, well, we won't defund radio, and we won't defund Indigenous languages, and we won't defund the French service. It's a very interesting hodgepodge.
Right. But particularly in these times where there's a decentralization of where people get their information and everybody's looking at their phone and without something that brings everyone together like the CBC,
I think tough, the CBC needs to play a role in that. It needs to take a good hard look at itself and say, what's our core mandate here and are we meeting it? Yeah. I don't think defunding it and getting rid of it's the answer. I think taking a look at where are the gaps.
To do an audit and show people here we're taking a look at it.
And I think regional is huge, like small towns and places where there isn't a strong local media, the CBC can come in and fill that role.
Needs to be in there, yeah. And any of these others that you wish to mention, you talk about the problems with strategic voting. You talk about the problems with polls.
Yeah.
I don't know what's wrong with the polls. Maybe you like the checks and not the polls. I don't know. But sorry, I had to drop that joke.
I will. The only one I'll talk about. I suggest people read the book for the
Yes.
because they're complicated. Right?
Yes.
Strategic voting. I make the case it's never worked and it never will work, but it's the most popular thing out there. People believe they have to pick the winner. So take a look at the book and why that doesn't work.
Right.
But secondly, polls, and I really did almost a change in poll. I was so mad at polls at the end of my last election run that I wanted to eliminate polls during an election campaign.
Okay.
I changed my mind talking to pollsters.
Right.
I think polls are important.
It's a data point.
It's a data point.
Yeah, it can't be the end-all, be-all. Right.
But we need to start putting some important guardrails on them. We have polls out there that have a plus or minus 9% margin of error. Yeah. That is a useless piece of information.
Well, that's a problem with the people that are taking the polls, don't you think?
Right. But so, you know what? I simply say make a rule, make a law. We have election laws on everything else that if your poll is above a margin of error of, say, 4 to 5%, you can't publish. Period. So that's the only other thing that I think, again, they'll have lots of people argue with me on that, but I'm prepared to have the argument.
Well, it's a very good read, and it's a relatively quick read. It's not a 1,000-page book. Again, it's called Storm the Ballot Box, An Insider's Guide to a Voting Revolution. It's congratulations, Joanne, and you can get it. It's published by Nimbus, one of our local publishers, and you can get it in good bookstores. So,
and I should add that the foreword's by Kim Campbell. People think that this is just going to be a green manifesto. It's not. I went out of my way to talk to people from all parties and to ask the former Prime Minister, conservative Prime Minister, to write the foreword. So. Great.
Well, yes, and you mentioned the Green Party. That's a good segue to the next part of our, because certainly it's your experience as a Green Party candidate ties in with this.
Yes.
That's very clear. A couple of news items with the Greens recently. About a month ago, there was a big splash, co-leadership. Besides the established leader Elizabeth May, there's now a new co-leader. Jonathan, is it Pednault?
Pednault.
Pednault. Okay, and so you have an established leader. You have a young leader. So this is an interesting interesting news item.
It is, I think, because it's the first in Canada for a party to have co-leadership.
It's unique.
Our election laws aren't even written for that. But it also means, we are a party now that has diversity in our leadership, which is interesting. Some would say, a gender balance.
Well, if any party's going to do it, the Green Party should do it, right?
Yeah, we're known for sort of, the Green Party is known for sort of blazing a trail. We move the Overton window for political scientists out there, because often, and this is the role of third and fourth parties, introduce things that time has come for the major parties to take on.
Right.
And I think that co-leadership is not new in Europe, for example. The German Greens have had co-leadership. The Australian Greens
but here
have
in
had
North America, it's a new
different.
thing. So that was one news item. The other one just today, Ontario Greens unveil costed election platform with promise to build 2 million new homes over the next 10 years. So Ontario, with this election coming in, they want to increase the density in the cities, so there's more housing. They want tax cuts for individuals under 65,000 and houses below 100,000 households. One of their platforms to save the money that in their budget is to cancel this big highway project, which got my attention because we talk about highways here, and the provincial leadership wants to build more highways and bring more cars into the city, a city that whose goal is to move away from cars. So that's interesting. So my question for you is that where are the local Greens? I would think that the Green Party here in Nova Scotia would be taking up this cause.
And I think if they, I think they do. I think they do care. But
I'm not saying they don't care, but I don't hear anything about them.
Why aren't you hearing them? And I'll tell you why you're not hearing them. Two things. when you don't have any elected members in the legislature,
which they have
which
zero
they
in
don't
Nova
here,
Scotia, yeah.
It's very hard to get media attention. And this goes back to what we were
and
talking
funding. There's no money
There's
in the coffers,
very
I
little
imagine.
money. I mean, they have a part-time employee.
Mm-hmm.
Everything else is volunteer. Their leader is a volunteer leader.
Who's the leader of the Green Party?
Anthony Edmonds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He's a rocket scientist, quite literally.
Ah.
And guess what? He works in transportation.
Okay.
And so,
But he has a full-time gig.
But he has a full-time job, and he has a little boy who's just a year, and it's
He's
very
busy.
hard to be out there.
Right.
So I totally agree that we need more green voices, and this is something I ran provincially, and one of the things I kept saying, people say, well, you're not going to form government, why would I vote for you? And I go, yes, but if you had a green voice in the legislature, at least these things would get raised. If you had a green MLA right now, they would be screaming about, well, you cannot just put money into highways. Where's money going into city transportation? Where, why aren't we making public transit free? Like, all of those things would be coming from Greens.
Now, to be fair, the local house is just opening, and I'm sure the NDP is going to take on these pieces.
And they will.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't hurt. Like, in Ontario, which we were just talking about, there are 2 Green MLAs.
2 out of the, 124 seats? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In BC, I think you've got 195 there. Don't quote me on that. But you have 2 Green MLAs. In PEI, you have 3 MLAs. And, they make a huge difference. They are people who are constantly agreeing with good policy, but raising questions. Yes, you have an opposition. Opposition parties are often just thinking about how do we become government. They're not thinking, because just being a good constituent MLA, which Greens are very good at that, is their first concern. Their second concern is making sure they're running herd on government and bringing in good policy suggestions.
Right.
And I think that makes a Green MLA and MP. I mean, think about Elizabeth May and Mike Morris, the 2 MPs we have in Ottawa. I mean, they punch way above their weight. I don't think anyone would disagree that Elizabeth May is probably one of the best-known small politicians in the country.
Right. So why aren't the Greens a bigger force in Nova Scotia and Halifax? Because when I look, as I'm learning about the country, it would make sense that you would have Greens in BC, you would have Greens here. I think that originally when the party was taking off, it was here. Why is there not a presence here? And there's probably many reasons, and this is not to blame anybody, but why? What's
there
happening?
is a reason. So in New Brunswick and in PEI, which I think are the closest examples for us to use. So New Brunswick has 2 MLAs. They have 3 in PEI. Part of the reason is they don't have an NDP.
But many people would say that Halifax is the most cosmopolitan of all of Atlantic Canada. So where are the Greens?
I think the Greens have to make a decision. Because funding in this province is based on your popular vote, it is very hard sometimes to decide we're going to pick one riding. We're going to put all our energy into that riding and that candidate, and we're going to try and win one riding. And
I interrupted you, but I think it is, I would agree with you, the fact that there's no NDP, and there's probably historical reasons for that in New Brunswick, that gives space for the Greens, doesn't it?
It does, and the same in PEI.
Oh, there's no NDP.
No Greens. Well, I mean,
no
there's
NDP,
an NDP party, but they have no one elected.
Oh, that's interesting. So here the NDP is established. There was a provincial leader from the NDP here.
Yeah. So I think that has made it harder because we have very similar policies to New Democrats. I would say we have a stronger environmental policy, and we can bring in maybe more. I was going to say leading edge. I won't say radical. Leading edge ideas. But I think that breakthrough, Mike Schreiner getting elected in Ontario, changed the situation there, and I think also that when we saw Peter Bevan Baker, who is the leader of the Greens in PEI, it was his 10th election when he got elected.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the Ontario election. Congrats, you have a piece in this last Saturday's Toronto Star, which I have open here.
People can buy at Atlantic News.
Yeah, exactly, and I'm going to take a look at it. But there's a quick rundown on the 4 main parties, and you provide the rundown for the Greens. And what's the quick takeaway from your piece?
Well, so it's again being very focused. Yes, they brought out a platform that I think is, people should read it because
This
it's
news article, they're making a splash.
They're making a splash. Same thing happened in New Brunswick. I was part of putting the platform together in New Brunswick. It was a brilliant platform. It's a platform that the party is very proud of. What has to happen, I think, is that we need to, and they're doing it in Ontario, they're concentrating on rural ridings because Doug Ford has basically run that province as if he's mayor of Toronto. And that's not playing well. If you're a farmer in, Wellington, Halton Hills, you're not thrilled that everything seems to be serving Toronto. So that's what they're concentrating on.
So Ontario, the focus on the rural, maybe that's a way forward here in Nova Scotia, perhaps.
I think so. A lot of times as Greens, we have felt that the chance to win would be in a Halifax riding, or an urban riding. And that maybe we're better off saying, let's pick, I would say, a coastal rural riding where people are concerned that there is no Coastal Protection Act, where people are worried about what's happening to
still
their
progressive-minded people, but not in the cities. Yes. Well, congrats on that Toronto Star piece, and Joanne, congratulations on the book. Again, it's called "Storm the Ballot Box: An Insider's Guide to a Voting Revolution." And the last piece here is we ask our guests, can you name a couple of books that changed your life? Either you're reading now, you just finished, or something you've read that you could recommend.
Well, I'm going to go way back, and I read Lament for a Nation when I was in university, and that wasn't yesterday, which is George Grant, and I revisited that recently, and I don't agree with a lot of what Grant says, but it's about trade with the United States, actually. So it's relevant again. And
Lament for a Nation.
Yeah, that book really had an impact on me. And as I said, I'm not in the same political mind space as the author, but boy, it got my brain working.
Got your brain.
On a more modern basis, I loved the book Teardown by Dave Muslin. And Dave Muslin looks at a lot of things, including proportional representation. It's a great read on PR. So I recommend, if you're interested in that, read Dave Muslin's Teardown. But recently, a book that fired me up was called Out of the Wreckage with George Monbiot. He's a Brit, very well-read columnist for The Guardian. And his book, Out of the Wreckage, basically takes a look at why neoliberalism is at the root of many of the things we'd like to change right now.
Yes.
And I know that sounds so heavy, but he's a good writer and it's easy to read.
Great. Well, thank you for those three, and those will be in the show notes, so you can take a look at these. But Joanne Roberts, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you for inviting me, Chris. Bye.
Take care.